Good evening, fellow truth seekers. Welcome to a discussion rooted in Genesis. What about the dinosaurs? So, as I'm recording this, we just completed week 3 in our verse-by-verse walk through Genesis. If you remember where we finished, we had just finished introducing the fact that there on day 5, God created both the fish as well as the birds. And so we just introduced that topic. We ran out of time. I was coming up on a discussion, just a brief discussion on dinosaurs, so I thought now would be the time to really tackle this question, what about dinosaurs? Now actually tonight we're going to tackle 3 questions. So we're going to really pick 3 that I want to deal with. The first one, does the Bible indicate that men and dinosaurs lived together? So that'll be the first question we go after. The second one, is there any evidence that would support dinosaurs lived thousands, not millions of years ago? Now keep in mind, I'm not dealing with the age of the earth. I'm not dealing with the age of creation. I'm not dealing with radiometric dating, just a brush with carbon-14 dating tonight. I'm not dealing with distant starlight. We will deal with all of those topics, but I'm just really focusing in, is there evidence that would support that dinosaurs lived thousands, not millions of years ago? We'll answer those other questions before it's all over as well. And then thirdly, is there any evidence that's to suggest that men and dinosaurs possibly lived together? Now, obviously, as you look at these questions, they all kind of blend together, right? But that's the way we're going to tackle them tonight as we answer the question, what about dinosaurs? So the word dinosaur, this next video is just a real quick video on the etymology of the word dinosaur.
In 1841, the first use of the term Dinosauria, meaning terrible lizard, was created by the famous British anatomist and paleontologist Sir Richard Owen. He used the term for the first time at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science held in Plymouth. After that meeting, the word dinosaur rapidly became a popular term to describe these giant lizards that were being discovered by paleontologists.
Okay, so as you think about that, in the English language, really, which is where the word for dinosaur, the genesis of the word started, that was not until 1841. So now as you think about the Bible, both the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament, well, the Hebrew Bible was completed approximately 400 years before the coming of Christ. So we should not expect to find a word that specifically means dinosaur. Now, we no doubt could possibly find words that are including dinosaur, but we should not expect to find a word that at the time meant dinosaur or something like that. And that's true for the Greek as well. The Greek New Testament was completed no later than 100 AD. We should not expect to find a word that specifically means dinosaur because, again, that word was not even invented until 1841. So with all these facts as the backdrop, let's begin to answer those questions. So question number 1, does the Bible indicate that men and dinosaurs lived together? So let's go back to where we were Sunday, and I'll sort of pick up the discussion. We're looking at creation, day 5. And God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 5th day. Now here in verse 21, Moses provides some additional commentary beyond just the water swarming with swarms of living creatures, where he says God created the great sea creature. The great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds. Now, I don't know what comes to your mind when you think about great sea creatures, whether it's blue whales, which are no doubt the largest sea creature that's ever been on the planet, up to 100 feet long, sperm whales up to 60 feet long, giant squid, giant octopus, massive oarfish. And I would argue all of those things are things you should be thinking about. But I do want to touch upon those 2 Hebrew words that are in play. The first Hebrew word that I want to bring your attention to is translated as great. That's gadol. It means great, large, big, massive. So God created these massive, these big, these large sea creatures. Now, the Hebrew word translated, two English words translated as sea creatures, the Hebrew word is tanin. It's used a total of 28 times in the Hebrew Bible. Now, rather than explain the word to you, I think I'll show you a few examples of the word before we advance, examples where the word's used, and we'll advance the argument from there. So Psalm 74:13, referring to what God did, you divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the tanin on the waters, the heads of the sea monsters. Very interesting translation. Isaiah 27:1. In that day, Yahweh, with his hard and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will slay the tanin, the dragon that is in the sea. Wow, that's really interesting. A dragon that is in the sea. Isaiah 51:9. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of Yahweh. Awake, as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Looking at this Hebrew word tanin, the King James translators 21 of the 28 times translate this word as dragon. I would suggest that at least in part, Moses is talking about some of these great sea creatures under the idea of dragon, or what we would now modern day call dinosaur. Now, look at Isaiah 27 there. You can see the mention of Leviathan. This is very interesting. God brings up Leviathan in a discussion with Job in Job 41. So let's take a look at that. There God says, picking up in verse 1, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook, or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you with soft words? Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Now you can see those are rhetorical questions, and the obvious answer in context is no, this guy's ferocious. You would not dare do those things. Will traders bargain over him? Will they divide him up among the merchants? Obviously no. Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Apparently no, you can't. He's too strong and powerful. Lay your hands on him. Remember the battle. You will not do it again. Behold, the hope of man is false. He is laid low even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. In other words, no one is so fierce that he would dare stir up Leviathan. And then the rhetorical question, who then is he who can stand before me? And I stop there in verse 10. I'll read just a few more verses. Picking up in verse 13, who can strip off his outer garment? Who would come near him with a bridle? Who can open the doors of his face? Around his teeth is terror. Verse 15, his back is made of rows of shields, shut up closely as with a seal. One is so near the other that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another, they clasp each other, and cannot be separated. Now clearly this creature sounds like an aquatic dinosaur. Job knew what it was. Job didn't question God and say, I don't know what you're talking about. And so again, this appears to be, in Job 41, an aquatic dinosaur. Now just an interesting commentary from Henry Morris. He says this in The Biblical Basis for Modern Science. If one will simply translate tanin as dinosaur, every one of the more than 25 uses of the word become perfectly clear and appropriate. Now, I'm not sure that I would take that broad of a sweeping approach to tanin, but I do agree overall with Henry's point, and that is that many times tanin is being used to describe a dinosaur. Going back to creation, we'll go to day 6. And God said in verse 24, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Now here God talks about 3 different categories of animals: livestock, creeping things, and beasts of the earth. Now none of these categories alone seem to hint at an area that contains only dinosaurs. But I would suggest that more than likely that broad category of beast of the earth does include dinosaurs. And creeping things might equally include some dinosaurs as well. What is interesting is, again, in God's discussion with Job, he brings up another dinosaur. In this case, it's a land-dwelling dinosaur named Behemoth. And so let's go and look at that discussion between God and Job. This is a chapter before. This is actually Job 40. Picking up in verse 15, God says, "Behold, Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword, for the mountains yield food for him, where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh." Now I do want you to notice just a couple of things that God brings up here. First, his tail is like a cedar tree, so apparently he has a very large tail. His bones are tubes of bronze. Okay, imagine bronze tubes for bones. That's the picture. His limbs like bars of iron. Again, this is a mighty, powerful beast. In fact, he's the first of the works of God. He's the most important of the works of God. He's the most powerful of the works of God. And then God made him as he made, or even indeed when he made, Job. Now, for many of us, if we have marginal notes in our Bible, it might say that this is likely an elephant or a hippopotamus. Well, I guess I could accept that an elephant has power in his belly. But I must tell you that tail is not like a cedar tree. And I suppose looking at a hippopotamus, I could accept that his power is in his belly, but indeed that is not like a cedar tree. But now when you start thinking about sauropod dinosaurs, in this case a Brachiosaurus, they indeed have power in their belly. They indeed have a tail like a cedar tree. They indeed have limbs that are like iron and bones that are like bronze tubes. The Brachiosaurus being up to 80 feet long and 80 tons. Or maybe we're thinking about a Sauroposeidon, a little bit bigger dinosaur in the sauropod family, but not quite as heavy. Or maybe we're thinking about an Argentinosaurus, one of the very big ones, 130 feet long, up to 110 tons. In any case, it seems to me that what God is parading before Job is clearly what we would call a dinosaur. Now, maybe at this point you're thinking, well, maybe God made dinosaurs at some other time. Well, keep in mind, we started this in Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." Again, we are looking at, on day one, the creation of the earth, the creation of energy, the creation of matter, the creation of time as the earth was rotating there in the darkness, and the creation of supernatural light. We go on in literal day creation, so there's no other place to put dinosaurs before the creation, before in the beginning, because there was nothing in the beginning before that but God. There was no time, there was no planet, none of those things existed. You can't put them there. You can't put them after the creation week, and I'll show you why in just a minute. And clearly, both Behemoth and Leviathan were alive when Job was alive. And equally, Tanin would be another example of a word that seems to be pointing to dinosaurs. But as we continue to think about this, here's what God said at the end of Genesis 1, going into chapter 2. And God saw everything that he had made. This was at the end of day 6. And behold, it was very good. And there was evening, there was morning, the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. That's all the host of the heavens, and that's all the host of the earth. God's not creating any more after the creation week. It's a little bit clearer in Exodus 20 in the giving of the 10 Commandments. God said this, "For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. We can stop there to get to the point, and all that is in them. So clearly, and we didn't even deal with fiery serpents, but clearly we talked about Tanin, we talked about Behemoth, we talked about Leviathan, we talked about the creation week, we talked about the only place these animals could be created. And so now I would take us back to our first question. Does the Bible indicate that men and dinosaurs possibly lived together? And I would say absolutely. In fact, with no preconceived notion, that is the conclusion one would come to from reading the Bible. So that's the first question, and we say to that, yes. Let's go to the second question. Is there any evidence that would support dinosaurs lived thousands, not millions of years ago? This next video clip is taken from Evolution's Achilles' Heels and discusses some surprise findings in dinosaur bones.
For about a decade now, there's been mounting evidence of soft tissue that's still preserved inside dinosaur bones. Now, if these bones are supposed to be millions and millions of years old, the soft tissues like blood vessels and red blood cells and other materials should have long since degraded. But starting in 2005, with the discovery of a dinosaur leg bone from Tyrannosaurus rex, there were these different soft tissues that were in there, and they were still stretchy. A blood vessel that could actually be taken with tweezers and stretched out would snap back into place. More material was discovered. Different types of proteins have been identified in laboratories. And now there are mounting evidences coming in from a wide range of different types of fossil animals from the so-called Age of Dinosaurs. We've got Tyrannosaurus rex, Triceratops, a duck-billed dinosaur, even eggs from sauropod dinosaurs. Those are the long neck ones from China. And so with mounting evidence now from not only North America, and not just one unit in North America, but from multiple levels of rock in the record, and from different continents, soft tissue is being identified more and more by more researchers in paleontology.
In 2013, a remarkable paper was published documenting the discovery of bone cells and DNA from dinosaur bone. Now, they proved the DNA with 3 independent chemical tests, and they also found DNA in certain parts of the cell, which is just what we'd expect to find if it was in a cell nucleus. Also, they found proteins called histones, and that's where DNA is coiled up in dinosaur cells. They would not be found in bacteria, so this rules out contamination. So the recent experiments on how fast DNA breaks down shows that even under ideal conditions, it would not last anywhere near the time since dinosaurs were meant to have become extinct. These ideal conditions are temperatures well below freezing. Now, in real life, dinosaurs were meant to have lived in very warm climates, and warmth means that DNA would decay even more quickly. Therefore, the presence of DNA in dinosaur bones is very strong evidence against the millions of years timescale.
So he mentioned the T-Rex fossil find in 2005. Dr. Jack Horner was overseeing the excavation of that T-Rex fossil in Montana. I believe it was at the Hell Creek Formation. Because the femur of the T-Rex that they unearthed was so large, they were not able to get that femur out, even using the helicopter that they had at their disposal. So they ended up having to break that femur into 2 different pieces. You can imagine how big that was. A few of those small pieces from where they broke it were sent to Dr. Mary Schweitzer. Now, she's the assistant colleague of Dr. Jack Horner. 60 Minutes is going to pick up the story here and develop it, but that's kind of the background.
What happened next happened by mistake. Mary put some fragments of the bone in acid to dissolve away the outermost layer of mineral. But the acid worked too fast, and all the mineral dissolved away. Being a fossil, there should have been nothing left. But there was, and it was elastic, like living tissue.
This is the piece.
No. She showed us video she took under the microscope.
That's really what happened?
Yes.
That's the dinosaur bone?
Without mineral now. That's what was left.
It looked like the soft tissue she would have expected to find if it had been modern bone, This was impossible. This bone was 68 million years old.
So you see this and you think, what? You say,
I didn't want to tell anybody.
you'd be ridiculed,
Yes.
right?
And so I said to my technician, okay, do it again. I don't believe it.
And yet, in sample after sample, they were there. Things that looked suspiciously like flexible, transparent blood vessels. She finally mustered the courage to tell Jack.
She said she dissolved the bone away and there were blood vessels. And, you know, I was like shocked. I mean,
How could that be?
How could that be? That's right.
The things Mary was finding inside dinosaur bones,
Look at that.
blood vessels, and even what seemed to be intact cells, pose a radical challenge to the existing rules of science, that organic material can't possibly survive even 1 million years, let alone 68 million. Mary, Jack, and their team published their B-Rex findings in a series of papers in the journal Science and were promptly attacked. Critics said their samples might have been contaminated, or that the supposed blood vessels were actually something called biofilm, a type of slime. But as Mary showed us, she's been able to replicate her findings. These are pieces of an even older dinosaur, a well-preserved 80-million-year-old duckbill. When she dissolved it away in acid,
Let's put this under the scope here.
well, look.
Is that a blood vessel?
This is a blood vessel.
You're
You
kidding.
see the branches right there? And look at all of them. And it's so consistent over and over and over again. We do this bone and it comes out and I get excited every time. I can't help it. I mean, 80 million years old.
Mary published her new results last year, and while some of her critics have been swayed, the controversy still rages, and the stakes are high. If blood vessels can survive 80 million years, what about DNA?
Well, and so we've already heard the answer about DNA, but blood vessels surviving 80 million years is rather interesting. We now have multiple examples of this, and there are really only two possibilities that one can come to. One, the bones are young, or two, tissue can survive tens of millions of years. The second one is ridiculous. Clearly what we're seeing is evidence that these bones are young, and they're not even completely fossilized. They're not millions or tens of millions of years old. Now, this next video clip is from Scientific America. It's a very simplified, although correct explanation of the formation of carbon-14, so how it's created, and how we can use carbon-14 to date the age of organic materials. We will talk in much greater detail about carbon-14 dating later on, but I need you to have this sort of information, this foundation, for an audio call that I'm going to let you in on here in a second. So again, this is really like carbon-14, very basic understanding of its formation and how we use it to date things.
How do we know how old something is? For people, we'd ask to see their birth certificate. For trees, we'd count the rings. But how do we know how old a fossil is? Fossils have their own internal clock. Scientists can read it by looking at the ratio of two different types of carbon atoms. Of course, every living thing is made of carbon. Plants grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use it to form complex organic molecules. Animals get their carbon by eating these plants. But there's more than one form of carbon. Most carbon atoms have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We call this carbon-12. High up in the atmosphere, sometimes cosmic rays hit nitrogen atoms. This creates carbon with 6 protons and 8 neutrons. We call this carbon-14. Carbon-12 and carbon-14 behave alike, but carbon-14 has one unique and important attribute. It's unstable. So once an animal dies, the carbon-14 in its body will start to go away. Every 5,730 years on average, about half of the carbon-14 atoms will decay into nitrogen. This is its half-life. After one half-life, the animal will have about half the amount of carbon-14 it started with. After another half-life, it will have about a quarter. And after another half-life, it will have about an eighth. By contrast, the amount of carbon-12 it has in its body will stay the same. By measuring the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, we can measure how many thousands of years have passed since the animal died. Carbon dating works for fossils up to about 60,000 years old. For older fossils, scientists use unstable elements that have much longer half-lives. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm Michael Moyer.
Okay, so before we jump off and really go to a review and summary, just a couple of things I want to remind you of. So max life time we're going to get out of a dinosaur using radioactive carbon dating or carbon-14 dating, probably not more than 60,000 years. The carbon-14 would be deplete at that time. It will have all converted back to nitrogen, and all that would be left was carbon-12. So you would not be able to measure any radioactive carbon. Okay, so that's the background for this phone call. Now, this next clip is actually an audio call between the host of KLTT, that Christian Talk Radio in Denver, Colorado, and he calls Dr. Jack Horner's office to discuss that T-Rex that we just reviewed. You'll understand once you start hearing the call what he's wanting to do and what he's getting at. His name is Bob Enyart, and you'll understand as soon as the call gets going. Now, I want you to pay particular attention to how the discussion progresses and ultimately how it ends. Okay, so Bob Enyart, and he's calling Jack Horner's office about the T-Rex.
Paleo. That's the paleontology department.
Paleo.
Hello, could I speak to Jack Horner?
Yeah, who's calling?
This is Bob Enyart with KLTT Radio in Denver, Colorado. That's Bob Enyart.
Yeah, let me transfer you over to his office. I think he should be in there right now.
Hello?
Hello, Jack. This is Bob Enyart with KLTT Radio in Denver.
Uh-huh.
How are you doing?
Good.
Jack, I sent a letter to Bob Harmon a few weeks back offering the museum a grant of $8,000 to do a carbon-14 date test of that soft tissue T-Rex you guys dug up. And he said he would forward that to you. And I'm wondering if you saw that or considered it.
Well, carbon-14 doesn't work on something that old.
I understand that, and normally we wouldn't expect to get soft tissue out of a T-Rex skeleton either, but sometimes science proceeds by crossing your T's and dotting your I's, and you guys might have other things you'd like to carbon-14 at the same time. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, I've been able to raise a little more money, so that's up to $10,000 now, that we'd be honored to give you guys if you would consider doing that test.
Well, we can't do that test.
You can't do that?
No.
Do you mean the museum doesn't have the laboratory?
We certainly don't.
Okay, well, we're happy to pay the expense of having a lab do the test in addition to the $10,000 to the museum.
Do you know how carbon-14 works?
Yeah, I'm familiar, and I realize it's useless for anything over maybe 50,000 years or so. But I've done a talk show in Denver for 15 years, and there's a group of folks interested in science. Of course, that discovery caught their attention, and they thought, well, it'd be logical to do this, to just go ahead and do it, even though nobody would be inclined to do it, just like nobody would be inclined to look for soft tissue inside of a T-Rex.
Well, yeah, and, you know, we're still trying to figure out what it is, what it's actually made of.
Right, exactly, whether it's hemoglobin or whatever.
Well, yeah.
Jack, is the amount too small that it's just not worth the consideration?
No, that's not it.
Okay. What if I were able to raise more money?
No, the amount of money has nothing to do with it. because carbon-14 doesn't work on something like this,
Right.
your results that you get could be all over the place.
Well, they should be infinity. It should be not datable. In other words, it shouldn't come back saying it's 25,000 years old.
Right.
It should be infinity. And so
Well,
that'll be a worthwhile...
Well, infinity isn't exactly what you get.
Okay.
I mean, it's like trying to date a piece of concrete.
Right. You
have to have carbon in it.
Right. You wouldn't use carbon-14. Now, the skeleton is not fossilized. Isn't that true, or largely not?
Well, it's the bone is made of calcium phosphate.
Mm-hmm.
Like I say, we're still trying to figure out what the actual soft tissue is.
Right. And see, we were hoping that a test like this would just add another bit of scientific information that you would have at your disposal. And also, in that grant letter, we asked if it could be a blind test with 5 different specimens, and therefore then the museum could test 4 other specimens that you might want to have carbon-14 dated, and so you could put it all in the same batch, and those testing then will pay the cost of that. That'll be free to the museum plus the $10,000 grant.
Let me tell you where I'm coming from here.
Sure.
All right. Obviously, your group is a group of creationists.
Yes.
And the spin they can get off of it,
right,
doing it, is not going to help us.
Yeah. So even though it's just a scientific test, they're not asking for voodoo or anything.
It's not actually a scientific test. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Carbon-14 dating something with soft tissue in it. Jack, if I could raise $20,000, would it be worth?
I will talk to Mary Schweitzer about it.
Okay. I appreciate that. And how about this? I'll resend you the grant letter with the amount of $20,000 in it. And then you could talk to Mary and we'll see where it goes.
I want to know what group is sponsoring it.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's
I mean I need some really specific details about.
Sure.
And don't just tell it to me straight. Okay.
Of course. I've hosted a daily talk show for 15 years. We're on a 50,000 watt AM station, KLTT. Mm-hmm. And there's a local church here, Denver Bible Church, mm-hmm. that's offered to help. But we also have pledges from any number of individuals in the Denver community.
Okay.
So we could, if you guys agree, we could send you the check within 24 hours.
Okay. Well, let me talk to Mary, and let me just talk to a few people.
Okay.
Because I don't want to, I can't afford to have it turn into a circus.
Right. Well, I do understand that, and I appreciate your time. So.
Okay. I will see Mary this next week.
Oh, that's fabulous. I'd be happy to call you back in 2 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you so much, Jack.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
So that ends a phone call. But really, I would ask you to ponder, why in the world would Dr. Jack Horner be worried about carbon dating something that's over 60 million years old that should be completely depleted long ago of radioactive carbon? And I would submit unto you that the reason he's worried about it is it would return a carbon date. And it wouldn't be a date around 50 or 60,000 years. We've dated many fossil dinosaur, or many dinosaur bones and parts by now, at this point in really our examination of the facts. And all of them return dates. And every time it's done by a creationist, it's argued that it was contaminated in situ, or if there's, the existence of blood cells and tissue and cells, and then the argument is a biofilm. And so let's talk a little bit about that, just so you're informed about it. So in closing on this point, many evolutionists have claimed that in these findings, we're not looking at bone, blood, or skin cells, but rather instead biological film from bacteria penetration called biofilm. So really, I just want to respond to that real quick, a brief video to answer the question, because that's always the charge when we start saying, well, these appear to be intact cells or intact DNA or intact blood or skin cells. And so just a quick video on that.
Decades ago, when researchers began publishing their discoveries of soft tissue with recognizable intact cells inside of dinosaur bones, plenty of shocked and highly embarrassed evolutionists disputed those results. After all, nobody knew, and by the way, still nobody knows, a process whereby flesh and bones could persist or survive over the so-called millions of years that evolutionists insist that dinosaur fossils have endured. One popular evolution explanation asserts that the soft tissues are not from the dinosaurs at all, but from bacteria that somehow infiltrated their bones and built what they call biofilms. Of course, the so-called bacterial biofilms just happen to have been built in the exact same shape as dinosaur tissue and cells. A new report of 8-inch long sheets of soft tissue inside a 22-inch long Triceratops horn presents extremely difficult hurdles for the so-called bacterial biofilm hypothesis. Two biology professors co-authored a scientific report just recently. Their electron micrographs showed fine details inside the bony Triceratops horn core. The authors obtained the horn from the Hill Creek Formation in Montana. It's famous for its well-preserved dinosaur remains. The horn was damp when removed from the rock, and it soon broke into several pieces, showing that it was already fractured. The researchers working from the biofilm hypothesis therefore suspected that the bacteria could have penetrated the horn through these cracks and then lived on the nearby liquid. Despite what promised to be a bacteria-friendly environment, the soft tissue they actually found looked nothing like the supposed bacterial biofilms that evolutionists use to explain the existence of soft tissue inside of dinosaur bones. Instead, when the research pair demineralized parts of the bones, soft tissues emerged as some of the dinosaur bones' original minerals departed. The study authors found these large strips of thin, light brown soft material. They also identified bone cells called osteocytes, including internal nucleus-like spheres, the author said, as well as other components expected to be found within the complex inner makeup of the distinct bone cells. A huge hurdle for the bacterial biofilm story of evolutionists is that no known biofilm looks just like bone cells, complete with their complex inner makeup components. This report of Triceratops soft tissue adds to the now long and ever-growing list of discoveries of original skin, blood vessels, blood and bone components found in several species of dinosaur remains, as well as other animals. The evolutionary bacterial biofilm explanation neither matches nor elucidates any of these finds.
So back to our three questions. Question number 2, is there any evidence that would support dinosaurs lived thousands, not millions of years ago? And again, I would argue absolutely there is. In fact, we just brushed up on it tonight. I didn't even bring up any of the carbon-14 tests we've done on dinosaur bones. We've got a lot more to say about this topic, but the quick answer is absolutely yes. So going back to our three questions, question number 3. Is there any evidence to suggest that men and dinosaurs possibly lived together? Okay, so earlier I briefly talked about tannin. I talked about how the King James writers had translated it 21 times dragon or dragons. I talked about the ESV picking up that with a couple of words. Now I want to pick back up that thread. So we had talked already that dinosaur is a modern word, so I really want to pick up the thread of the dragon in the use of the dragon, that word. So this is once again from Creation Magazine Live. This is Richard Fangrad and Calvin Smith, and they're discussing dragons and dinosaurs.
What's interesting is you will often see sometimes people equate dinosaurs with dragons. You've heard creationists say that before. There's dragon legends all over the world from virtually all people groups. They've described seeing these huge reptilian beasts,
Right.
et cetera,
Yeah.
et cetera. And this has been kind of mythologized. But even in the World Book Encyclopedia in 1973, we hear this quote: "The dragons of legend are strangely like actual creatures that have lived in the past. They are much like the great reptiles, dinosaurs, which inhabited the earth long before man is supposed to have appeared on earth." So they're even noting this. They're saying, well, wait a sec. If people have these descriptions of creatures that sound like dinosaurs, call them dragons because dinosaurs is a modern word, that's kind of strange because dinosaurs and people aren't supposed to have lived together.
Right.
And a scientist and an atheist, Louis Jacobs, author and former president of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology, made this really startling claim here. He said, well, you don't want to associate dinosaurs with dragons. Why? Such an association would dispel an Earth with vast antiquity. The entire history of creation, including the day of rest, could be accommodated in the 7 biblical days of the Genesis myth. Evolution would be vanquished. That is huge. He's saying, wait a second, don't equate dinosaurs and dragons because that's going to blow evolution out of the water.
So if dinosaurs lived recently, that blows the evolutionary timescale out, which of
Right.
course destroys evolution itself.
Exactly, and then you can't
Wow.
be an atheist because you have to believe in evolution to
Yes.
be an atheist.
So this next video clip, Legends of Dragons, is from Dr. Jason Lyle. He's one of the lead speakers there at Answers in Genesis. We'll be there just in, gosh, what, a month and a half. This is taken from the video Dinosaurs in the Bible.
That being the case, would you expect to find some legends of dinosaurs in history? Keeping in mind they're not going to be called dinosaurs, that's a modern word, but would we find legends of dragons? Do we find legends of dragons? You bet. We find lots of legends of dragons, like the legend of St. George and the dragon. The legend goes that St. George came into this town. The town was being victimized by a dragon that was eating their livestock, and they were actually going to sacrifice a lady to this dragon, hoping to appease it. St. George rides in, slays the dragon, and saves the lady, converts the town to Christianity. People say, oh, that's just a myth. Well, maybe. On the other hand, maybe this was a real creature that he came in and killed. Maybe it was a dinosaur. We've actually found fossils of Baryonyx, a sort of a type of dinosaur in that region. Did you know that Marco Polo in AD 1271 reported that the Chinese royal chariots were occasionally pulled by dragons? In the year 1611, the Chinese emperor appointed the position of royal dragon feeder, which hardly makes sense if there were no dragons to feed, doesn't it? 1611, not that long ago, really, certainly not millions of years ago. And there are lots of legends of various dragons. There's a city in France that was renamed in the honor of the killing of a dragon there. The animal is described as being larger than an ox and had long, sharp, pointed horns on its head. Sounds a little bit like a triceratops, doesn't it? Around the year 900, there was an Irish writer who recorded an encounter with a large animal. The creature had a head shaped somewhat like a horse's and had iron on its tail that pointed backwards, had thick legs and strong claws. The description matches known dinosaurs such as Stegosaurus and Kentrosaurus. Can't be sure, but it sure sounds like one. This one's a really well-documented case. On May 13th, 1572, around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there was an Italian peasant who was walking behind his cart. His oxen were pulling the cart, and they got down on the road because there was a little hissing dragon up in front of them. And the man actually had a rod with him at the time. It was actually a small creature, and he came up and whacked it on its head and killed it. And he brought the body in to a naturalist at the time, Ulysses Aldrovandus, who carefully studied the carcass and reported that it was unquestionably a reptile, one unlike any others he had seen. It had a very long, slender neck and a thick body. The description fits that of a Tanistropheus. So we think we might actually know what species it was from the description. What about the flying reptiles? Any records of those? Well, we do have records of flying reptiles in recorded history. The Greek historian Herodotus records an encounter with these winged serpents, flying reptiles. He says he finds out about this place where there are lots of these flying reptiles, which sound an awful lot like Rhamphorhynchus, one of these small flying reptiles that had the long tail. And he goes to this valley to find out about them. He says, I went to learn about the winged serpents. When I arrived there, I saw innumerable bones and backbones of serpents, many heaps of backbones, great and small and even smaller. Winged serpents are said to fly from Arabia at the beginning of spring, making for Egypt, but the ibis birds encountered the invaders in this pass and killed them. And the legends say that the Egyptians used to worship the ibis birds because the ibis birds killed the Rhamphorhynchus. The Rhamphorhynchus were poisonous. So it did him a little service, and the Egyptians worshipped the ibis birds for that. He says the serpents are like water snakes. Their wings are not feathered, but very like the wings of a bat. So he's going out of his way to say this isn't a bird. It's not feathered. It's got wings like a bat, membranous kind of wings, and it's a serpent, and therefore a reptile, flying reptile. Really amazing.
So a little bit more on dragons. Going back to Creation Magazine Live, again, this is Richard Fangrad and Calvin Smith with a little more discussion on dragons.
The flag of Wales actually has a dragon on it. Some of the biblical commentaries from several hundred years ago actually referenced people seeing dragons.
Right. Very old books.
Yeah.
Yes.
The zodiac, the Chinese zodiac, has all these animals that we readily recognize, modern, and it's got
Real
a dragon.
animals,
Yeah.
plus a dragon.
Why one mythological dragon? Marco Polo, he was a well-known historian, and he describes seeing these huge reptilian beasts, these dragons. Some of the artifacts we found, of course, one of the oldest artifacts ever found was this Mesopotamian cylinder seal. And if you look at the creatures there, 4 legs, big long neck, big long tail, looks like one of the sauropod dinosaurs. The head looks
Right.
a little different, but you don't know what could be soft tissue. You don't
It's
know what it
interesting,
looks
too,
like.
how they have their necks wrapped around each other that way.
Yeah, and keep that in mind because some other interesting artifacts they found. Of course, Dracorex. You did an article on that in Creation Magazine.
Yeah, a little article.
And what does it look like? I mean, even the people who funded it here, there's a little sign down there. It says it's a dinosaur that looks like a dragon. Well, that's what we've been saying all
to make
along.
the connection between dinosaurs and dragons even stronger. I mean, here's a thing that looks
Exactly.
like a dragon.
Yeah. Carl Sagan, once called the smartest man in America. Of course, he's an atheist, wrote the book Dragons of Eden, trying to explain why people groups all over the world have these memories of seeing these dinosaurs that they call dragons.
So he's not a Christian. What did he say?
Well, basically, he came up with this thought that basically in our past, when we were just some greedy little mammal or something, we saw these dinosaurs, and it was so frightening that it imprinted in our memories, somehow in our DNA. And that memory got passed along till finally we evolved into humans. Here we are, and we remember seeing these things. But of course, we didn't live with this. I mean, that's preposterous.
And that's what he said in his book.
That's what he said in his book.
Wow.
He makes a connection between dragons. He says that many cultures have these legends and all that kind of stuff. So just astounding evidence. Cambodia. 800 years ago, they carved this stone column. You look in the center of the column, what's it look like? I do dinosaur talks with kids, 4 legs. You can see the creature's tail, the plates on its back. You got 7-year-old kids. That's a Stegosaurus. Well, they didn't have dinosaur books in Land Before Time and Jurassic Park 800 years ago in Cambodia.
So maybe they had real live dinosaurs.
Well, it would make sense that that's probably what they saw.
Yeah.
Here's Bishop Bell, his tomb in Carlisle Cathedral. You see the creatures there. They look like dinosaurs. And look, they've got their necks wrapped around each other too, just like the Mesopotamian cylinder seal, separated hundreds of years chronologically and hundreds of miles distance geographically, and yet people record the same activity.
So, thousands of legends of people seeing or killing dragons. A great book if you're interested in this, Dragons: A Natural History by Schuker. We already talked about the Chinese zodiac. It is interesting that we have 11 real animals and then a dragon. This is a slate palette from King Narmer, the first pharaoh of the United Kingdom, and you can see the long-necked dragons, dinosaurs, look like some type of sauropod dinosaur. Here's a replica where you can see it a little bit better of that plate. Here's here's a piece of Egyptian pottery. Shows 2 long-necked dinosaurs with some type of goat or ram or lamb that they're eating there. Here is a long-necked creature found on the Hippo Tusk magic wand, 12th century BC in Egypt. Again, you can see what appears to be some type of long-necked creature. When we talked through Daniel, we talked about how Babylon had been found. We looked at the Ishtar gates, and we looked at the processional way. We talked about, this is actually one of the pictures from the processional way, the Ishtar gate. You can see the line, but then there's also dragons, and this is actually came right out of the sand, untouched, in the Pergamon Museum. It is interesting. They have what appears to be some type of dragon. Alexander the Great reported that when he conquered parts of what is now India in 326 BC, his soldiers were scared by the great dragons that were living in the caves. Viking ships have dragon heads as the mascot. We talked about Bishop Bell there in the Carlisle, Cumbria, England. You can see the two long-necked dinosaurs. The crest of Lithuania has a man killing a dinosaur. This is a Russian medallion with a man killing a dinosaur. This is a Bulgarian postage stamp with a guy shooting an arrow at a dinosaur. Really just very, very, it's just embedded in the culture. This next video is about the Nazca Indians in the Acambor, the Nazca Indians are in Ica, Peru, and the Acambor and the natives in Acambor, Mexico. Fascinating video.
The highly technical ancient civilization of the Nazca Indians flourished on the southern coast of Peru from around 1 AD to 750 AD. This culture produced an array of beautiful crafts and technologies such as ceramics, textiles, and geoglyphs. It is still not understood exactly how the Nazca produced their incredible geoglyphs called the Nazca lines. They also produced thousands of carvings on burial stones. These stone carvings, which are known as the Ica stones, are an enigma. There have been over 16,000 of these remarkable stones found over the past 50 years. They contain images of daily life, battle scenes, agriculture practices, medical procedures, advanced technologies, and most amazingly, dinosaurs. Many skeptics have tried to debunk the Ica stones by saying that they are a modern-day creation, but the evidence indicates differently. In 1535, Spanish conquistadors came through Peru in the area where the Nazca Indians had lived. They reported finding stones with strange animals carved on them. The designs and patterns on the stones also indicate that they were authentic from the Nazca culture, and of the 16,000, only about 500 had carvings of dinosaurs on them. Consequently, many of the carvings have nothing to do with the dinosaurs whatever. They were simply observations from everyday life of the Nazca culture. In Acambaro, Mexico, since the 1960s, over 56,000 ancient clay figurines have been discovered. Many of these clay artifacts are sculptures of dinosaurs. The approximate age of these clay figures is around 4,500 years old. Many people have studied these figures, and the opinion of their authenticity is divided. Most who have no preconceived biases believe that they are genuine, but others who believe that the dinosaurs died off millions of years ago state that they remain skeptical in spite of the radiocarbon dating and investigative evidence that points to their authenticity.
So if this issue with the Ica stones interests you, a great book, The Secrets of the Ica Stones and the Nazca Lines. I do have a replica of one of the Ica stones. I will probably bring that Sunday to Sunday school just so you can see that. Continuing about the Ica stones, the current estimate overall is somewhere between 50 and 55,000. The largest collection is in Dr. Javier Cabrera's museum, and although he's dead, his son is still the curator of the museum that his father started in the mansion. The current estimate of the number of stones in the museum is that 15 to 16,000 range. The largest find occurred in 1961. The Ica River flooded, and that uncovered burial zones and exposed literally hundreds of stones at one time. To this day, forged and real stones can be purchased in Peru. The forgeries are obvious when viewed under magnification, and the book talks about this, showing recent tooling, sharp cuts, and metal flakes are left behind. They also lack the fine patina oxidation in the incisions in the cuts that had grown on the stones that were cut hundreds or even thousands of years ago. This is a photo, This is a photo from Dr. Cabrera's museum, just to show you one room and the number of stones. Here's a stone with a number of different dinosaurs on the stone. You can just, the stone is kind of covered just in dinosaur pictures. Here's two more stones with different dinosaurs. An additional stone with a guy who's riding a dinosaur. But if this interests you, the book is great. And again, I will try to bring in a replica Sunday. There's also a lot of interesting modern evidence. I'm not going to spend much time here. I'll just bring up one example. Again, in the case of all of these areas that I talked about tonight, we're really just scratching the surface to sort of generate some interest and really help you understand where I land and why I land there. But I do want to show you one, I think, very interesting piece of modern evidence. This comes from the book Shipwrecks and Sea Monsters off California's Central Coast by Reinstedt. And here is a picture of this animal that washed ashore in November of 1925. You can see the body, you can see the head, and you can see the long neck. Short video on this I do want to show you that sort of pulls all this together for you.
In 1925, this creature washed up on the coast of California. E.L. Wallace, president of the Natural History Society of British Columbia, said, "My examination of the monster was quite thorough. It had no teeth, its head is large, and its neck full 20 feet long. I would call it a type of plesiosaur." Another witness, Judge W.R. Springer of Santa Cruz, felt the creature was from a prehistoric age. He added his observation: evidence of 2 short feet or flippers, and probably swam with its head high above the water.
Again, great piece of modern evidence, fascinating. So what happened to the dinosaurs? Well, following the flood, the new conditions on Earth made it very difficult for dinosaurs. And we will talk about that when we get to the flood. But equally, following the flood, post-flood, men killed them for meat because they were a menace, to prove their superiority, kind of win the damsel over. And then obviously there was competition for the land and other resources, and so they would kill these animals. But what if I told you I had photo evidence of man with dinosaurs? Well, indeed I do. I'll share that with you. Again, I was a little surprised, even shocked, I guess, although Sandy doesn't look quite as shocked as I do. But there, when that T-Rex showed up, and of course I'm just having fun, we did that there at the Creation Museum many years back. But to go to the third question, is there any evidence to suggest that men and dinosaurs possibly lived together? And there's actually, we brushed upon it tonight, but again, I would say absolutely. There is evidence that would support that men and dinosaurs lived together. So as we take in all these questions, number one, the Bible seems to indicate that men and dinosaurs were created together. There's plenty of evidence that it would indicate that dinosaurs lived thousands, not millions or tens of millions of years ago. And then equally, as we brush the evidence, there is evidence that men and dinosaurs lived together, and there's more than this. So in conclusion, just sort of wrapping this up, I would come back to what we were told in Exodus. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. Dinosaurs were created on days 5 and 6, the applicable type of dinosaur. And everything in the Bible tells us that. What we see as we seek to understand when did dinosaurs really live, it tells us that. And then equally, the evidence of dinosaurs and men living together tells us that. So that really brings me to the end and the wrap up of a discussion rooted in Genesis. What about the dinosaurs? So I hope to see you Sunday. God bless you, and I pray you have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.